There are moments in life when you're not looking back at the past, yet the past quietly finds its way to you. Just a very brief second, a familiar feeling, a memory passing softly through your mind. And then, you realize you are no longer the person you were back then. For Libra, growth rarely arrives through dramatic changes. It's felt in quieter ways, in how you pause and look back, in how certain stories that once mattered deeply now leave only a gentle echo. Maybe what's worth listening to isn't the past itself, but this present moment, when a memory suddenly returns, not to pull you back, but to whisper something you're finally ready to understand. And from that very moment, everything begins to slow down, so the memory can knock very softly. There are stories we once believed had been closed for a long time, not because they no longer mattered, but because life moved us forward too quickly, until one day, they return in a very different way. No clear reason, no invitation, just a small moment in the day, when your mind becomes quiet long enough for an old memory to gently touch something inside you. For Libra, moments like this arrive with subtlety. You're not pulled back into the past, you simply pause and look at it, like looking at a faded photograph, and quietly ask yourself, who was I when I was living inside that story? What's unique about Libra is the depth of perception. You don't just remember a person. You remember the atmosphere that once surrounded the connection, the way you spoke, the way you stayed silent, the way you tried to keep everything balanced, even when your heart wasn't truly at ease. The memory doesn't return to ask you to fix anything. It doesn't come to demand a new decision. It simply stands there like an old mirror reflecting who you were yesterday. And perhaps the most important part isn't the story itself, but the distance between who you were then and who you are now. Libra doesn't grow by becoming harder. You grow by understanding more deeply, by realizing there were moments when you placed harmony above your true feelings. Moments when you chose silence to keep the peace, instead of speaking what you needed. These realizations aren't meant to make you blame yourself. They simply show you how far you've come. When an old memory resurfaces, Libra doesn't rush to react. You allow yourself to feel it fully without letting it lead you astray. You begin to understand that not everything that once mattered needs to remain present. Some memories only need to be acknowledged, so you can gently place them back where they belong in your heart. There's a quiet grace in this stage of life. You no longer search the past for answers. You're no longer waiting for a late explanation. You simply listen to what the memory is reminding you about yourself. And often, the message isn't about someone else. It's about what you once gave up, about how you once loved, about how you once hoped. The Libra you are now can look back and smile. Not because everything was perfect, but because you've grown enough to understand that every story had a reason for existing. The memory knocks very softly, not to disrupt your life, but to remind you that you've changed. And when you realize you're no longer standing where you once were, you notice something else. The balance you once searched for outside is now slowly forming within. This isn't indifference. It's peace born from understanding. Understanding that the past doesn't need to be denied and doesn't need to be carried like a burden. It only needs to be looked at again, with respect, and then allowed to leave in the gentlest way. Libra once stepped into relationships with a genuinely beautiful intention. You wanted everything to feel harmonious. You wanted no one to be hurt. You wanted the space between two people to stay in a state of okay. And along the way, you became very good at listening. You learned how to yield naturally. You learned how to adjust yourself to meet the other person where they were. But there's something Libra often realizes much later. When you're too busy keeping a relationship balanced, you can forget to listen to yourself. When an old story is brought back to mind, the focus is no longer on what the other person did, or where they may have gone wrong. What invites deeper reflection instead is this question: who did I become when I was beside them? Some relationships once felt deeply important, not because of how long they lasted, but because they shaped how you saw yourself during a certain chapter of your life. Libra remembers that feeling clearly, the feeling of weighing every word, the feeling of choosing silence to keep the surface calm, the feeling of placing someone else's needs first, hoping that, over time, everything would naturally find its balance. The memory doesn't return to blame you for those choices. It simply allows you to see that you loved in the only way you knew how at that time. And from there, you begin to understand something important. Not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay for the long term. Some people arrive as markers along the path. They come to help you experience a particular version of yourself. They remain long enough for the lesson to be learned. And when that lesson is complete, the road quietly divides into two different directions. That doesn't make the relationship meaningless. Quite the opposite. Because it had limits, its value becomes clearer. As Libra matures, you begin to see that holding on to everything isn't the same as loving. Sometimes love is knowing when to let go without carrying resentment with you. You no longer look at the past through a lens of judgment. You no longer ask yourself what you should have done differently. You understand that, at that time, you did the best you could with what you knew. And now, when the memory returns, it no longer has power over your emotions. It simply stands there as a story that has already been completed. There's a very subtle shift happening within Libra. You begin to clearly distinguish between honoring a memory and holding on to an old version of yourself. You can remember without going back. You can feel gratitude without remaining in the same role. Boundaries, something you once hesitated to set, now become an expression of respect. Not to push anyone away, but to keep yourself whole. And when you allow yourself to look back at an old story without the urge to fix it, you begin to understand this. Peace doesn't come from every relationship being complete. It comes from not losing yourself in any relationship. Not everyone from the past remains within you, but everyone who once passed through left a mark that helped you understand more clearly who you are and what you truly need to feel balanced. And from that awareness, a new chapter slowly opens. One where you no longer try to hold everything at any cost, but choose instead to protect the quiet peace within you. Libra is often spoken of as a symbol of balance, a beautiful image, an ideal many people admire. But there's something rarely said out loud. Pursuing balance for too long can sometimes make you forget where you're standing in your own life. In many relationships, Libra doesn't enter with the desire to win. You simply want things to feel gentle. You want the space between two people to remain undisturbed. You want harmony to stay intact, even when unanswered questions begin to form inside you. And over time, you become the one who adjusts, the one who smooths things over, the one willing to step back slightly so nothing tilts too far. But here's the subtle truth. When you keep standing in the middle, you can slowly lose touch with yourself. True balance isn't about making both sides feel okay. It isn't about carrying the heavier weight so someone else can feel lighter. Real balance begins the moment you allow yourself to be honest about your own feelings. When an old story resurfaces, Libra may notice something clearly. There were times you worked very hard to keep everything in a state of fine, not too happy, not too sad, not too tense. But the cost of being fine was placing your own feelings a little lower each day. You didn't do this because you were weak. You did it because you believed in harmony. You believed that if you were patient enough, everything would eventually find its balance. And that belief, at certain points in your life, helped you preserve many relationships. But when you look back now, you begin to understand something else. Keeping a relationship is not the same as keeping your peace. Libra's growth doesn't come from changing who you are at your core. It comes from learning to ask a different question. No longer, how can both of us be okay? But instead, am I okay in this silence? That's not an easy question to answer, and it doesn't require an immediate response. It only asks that you be honest enough to listen. When you allow yourself to look back at an old story without self-blame, you begin to see this clearly. The fact that you didn't speak your feelings wasn't wrong. It simply reflected what you understood at that time. Everyone learns how to love and how to balance in their own way. And Libra learns this lesson by experiencing the subtle difference between keeping the peace and keeping yourself. True balance doesn't require sacrificing your peace. It doesn't demand that you always stand in the middle. It allows you to step aside when you realize you're shrinking yourself to fit. There's a kind of peace very different from surface-level calm. It's the peace that comes when you don't need to explain yourself too much, when you don't need to adjust your emotions to meet someone else's expectations. And when you reach that kind of peace, you no longer feel the need to keep everything balanced at any cost. You understand that the most sustainable balance is built from within. Libra at this stage doesn't lose their gentleness. You simply add clearer boundaries, not to create distance, but to ensure that what remains truly matters. And that is the lesson old stories leave behind. Not to change who you are, but to help you understand this. You deserve a balance that does not hurt you. Not everything that returns comes with an invitation to begin again. Some things reappear in your mind only to be seen more clearly, under a different light, now that you're no longer standing where you once were. Libra enters this phase with a very subtle shift. You no longer feel pulled back into the past. You're simply standing still, grounded enough to observe an old story without reacting. Then it might be a fleeting image, an incomplete memory, a feeling that was once familiar but no longer makes your heart tremble. And in that moment, you realize something quietly important. You have truly moved through it. No more blame. No more need to understand why everything happened the way it did. No more what-if questions. Because you know those assumptions belong to a version of yourself you are no longer living as. Libra's growth isn't loud. It doesn't come from big decisions or bold declarations. It comes from being able to look back at something that once confused you without feeling the need to change its ending. There is a kind of healing that runs very deep. It doesn't come from forgetting, but from understanding. Understanding that every story has its season. Understanding that what once felt unfinished wasn't because you did something wrong, but because you and that story were only meant to walk together for a certain distance. This month, Libra can feel that clearly. You look at an old memory with a calm you didn't have before. Not because you've become cold, but because you're more whole inside. You no longer search for closure from someone else. No late conversation, no final explanation, no additional validation. Closure happens quietly when you understand that the story has already fulfilled its role in your journey. There may have been a time when you believed that something returning meant it was still unfinished, but now you begin to see it differently, as a sign that you've matured enough to understand more deeply. To understand that not every connection needs to continue to have value. Not every memory needs to be carried into the present. Some things only need to be acknowledged so you can gently set them down. Libra in this stage doesn't rush to close the door on the past. You open it just long enough to see what you've learned, and what you see isn't a mistake. It's growth. The growth of someone who once invested so much energy into keeping the peace, and is now learning to protect clarity within. What returns doesn't come to disrupt your present life. It comes so you can smile and realize this. You're no longer standing at the same starting point. There's a very gentle tenderness in understanding that you grew from what once confused you, that you don't need to rewrite the past to prove that your present is valid. You only need gratitude. Gratitude for what once arrived. Gratitude even for what chose to leave. And when you allow an old story to close through understanding, you don't just release a memory, you open a new space within yourself. A space where peace no longer depends on what has already passed. There was a time when Libra waited, waiting for an explanation clear enough to make sense of everything, waiting for a sentence that could bring clarity, waiting for a sign that you hadn't misunderstood your own story. You weren't waiting because you were weak, but because you valued fairness. You believed that if everything were spoken fully, if every loose end were placed where it belonged, your emotions would finally feel soothed. And within that belief, you spent a great deal of energy listening to others, reading between silences, trying to understand what was never said out loud. But over time, you began to notice something different. Not every story comes with a clear ending. Not every relationship leaves behind a complete explanation. And not every silence is waiting for you to decode it. When an old story resurfaces, the Libra you are now no longer feels restless. You no longer ask, "Do I still need to hear something more?" Instead, you return to a different question, slower, deeper. How well have I understood myself in this story? There is a very important moment in Libra's path of growth. It's the moment you realize this. Healing doesn't come from someone else acknowledging your feelings, but from you no longer doubting your own. You no longer need anyone to confirm that you tried. You don't need anyone to agree that you were hurt. You know it. And that knowing is steady enough to let you stand tall. In the past, you may have believed that an apology would bring relief, that a late explanation would help you close the door. But now, you see more clearly. What you need doesn't live in someone else's words. It lives in how honestly you showed up for what you felt. It lives in no longer trying to edit your memories to fit someone else's version of the story. There is a very quiet freedom in no longer waiting for the past to speak. You allow it to exist exactly as it was, nothing added, nothing taken away. And within that silence, you realize something important. Peace doesn't require everyone's agreement. Libra at this stage is no longer searching for fairness outside. You begin building it from within, not by denying your emotions, but by trusting your own experience. When you no longer need an answer from someone else, you're no longer bound by what was never said. You don't need to go back to ask more questions. You don't need to reopen old conversations. You simply allow yourself to move forward without carrying expectation. This doesn't make you cold, it makes you lighter. Lighter because you're no longer placing the responsibility for your healing in someone else's hands. Libra begins to understand this. Everyone can only give what they are capable of giving. And sometimes, another person's silence is not the answer you need. When you understand that, you no longer feel incomplete. You no longer feel as though you're waiting for one final piece to finish the story. The story is already complete in your own way. And in that moment, you feel a very different kind of freedom. A not freedom because everything was resolved, but because you no longer need to explain yourself to the past. When you no longer need anyone to validate what once happened, you walk more lightly, not because you forgot, but because you understood. And that is when Libra touches a kind of peace that requires no one's permission. If there is something worth listening to in this season of your life, Libra, it may not be a grand piece of advice, and it may not be a loud message. It may be just a very gentle reminder. You don't need to return to places you've already moved through, not because those places lost their value, but because you carried with you everything you needed when you left. You don't need to fix what has already completed its purpose. Some stories don't need to be rewritten to feel whole, because it was their very incompleteness that helped shape who you are today. And perhaps the only thing you need to do now is carry the lesson and keep walking forward, a little lighter than before. Libra doesn't always recognize growth the moment it happens. Your growth doesn't arrive through clear milestones. It comes quietly, through the way you no longer react as you once did, through the way you no longer feel the need to explain yourself so much, through the way you allow certain things to remain in memory but no longer exist in the present. Some old stories resurface not to be held on to, but to help you realize that you're no longer standing where you once were. You can remember a relationship without wishing it would return. You can think of a person without wondering whether they still belong in your life. Not because you've become indifferent, but because you've learned how to place things where they truly belong. There is a kind of peace very different from the feeling that everything is simply okay. It's the peace that comes when you no longer try to keep balance for everyone, when you no longer stand in the middle to reconcile things that are no longer yours to carry. The Libra you are now still holds gentleness, still holds empathy, but you no longer trade your inner peace to keep a story going. You begin to understand this. Not everything that leaves is a loss. Some things leave to make room for clarity. And when you are calm enough to look back at the entire journey, you can see something deeply human. Every story that passed through your life taught you how to love, not only others but yourself, in a more mature way. And this month doesn't ask you to do anything more. It doesn't demand change. It simply invites you to pause for a moment and recognize this. You've come a long way. Farther than you once believed, farther than the doubts you carried in the past. And perhaps the quietest lesson for Libra is this. You don't need to carry your entire past to prove that you've grown. The way you live today, gently, clearly, honestly with yourself, is enough. When you allow yourself to move forward without looking back for confirmation, you open a new space within, a space where peace no longer depends on what is already past, and where the future doesn't need to be hurried into shape. There is only the present. And you, right here, more whole than yesterday. If any part of this reached you in its own way, let it stay with you in the way that feels right. You don't need to understand everything. You don't need to agree with it all. Sometimes, a story told at the right moment is enough to remind us that we're on the right path. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Keep walking at your own pace, Libra. No rush, No need to prove anything. Just be true to yourself.